The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of insects trapped in glass. 7 doctors had refused him. Not declined. Refused. Each one had found a reason, a policy, a liability concern. Dr. Morrison citing scheduling conflicts, Dr. Patel claiming insufficient experience with combat injuries, Dr. Welsh invoking insurance pre-authorization delays, Dr. Hammond referencing liability exposure, Dr. Chen mentioning equipment unavailability, Dr. Okonkwo noting transferred care complications, and finally Dr. Reynolds simply walking away mid-consultation. The veteran in the wheelchair had been sitting in the trauma bay for 4 hours with shrapnel fragments still embedded near his ribs, waiting. They didn't know what was waiting with him. The intelligence officer standing at the medication cart knew. She was watching the refusals happen in real time, each one confirming what she'd suspected about Dr. Pierce for the past 8 months. The truth didn't just silence the room, it was going to reshape it entirely. Hannah Clarke had worked at St. Michael's for exactly 8 months, 14 days, and 6 hours. She kept the count less out of impatience and more out of necessity. Time management at an undercover assignment meant precision. The hospital operated in predictable rhythms, morning shift changes at 6:36 a.m., surgical rounds at 8:13 a.m., peak emergency admissions between 11:38 p.m. and 2:06 a.m. She had learned every rotation, every staff member's schedule, every entrance and exit. She had become invisible in the way soldiers understand invisibility, not by hiding, but by being so competent, so unremarkable, that people looked through her rather than at her. The Norfolk summer pressed against the hospital windows like a living thing. Outside, the James River glinted in the late afternoon heat. Inside, the ward smelled of antiseptic layered over stale coffee and something underneath that never quite left, the copper iron scent of old blood soaked into hospital linoleum. St. Michael's was a regional trauma center, which meant Hannah had access to everything she needed. The cardiothoracic wing. The surgical suites. The procurement records. Her hands moved through the morning medication distribution with mechanical precision. Her nails were kept brutally short, her fingers calloused from years of things that had nothing to do with nursing. A faint scar ran across her left palm, a medical-grade cut from her last deployment, the kind that never quite healed into invisibility. She kept it visible. Nurses had scars. Combat medics had scars. The overlap was supposed to be unremarkable. The charge nurse, Patricia, glanced at her as Hannah approached the medication cart. "You're on floor 3 today. Bed 401 through 410. Dr. Pierce wants the charts updated before noon." "Understood," Hannah said. The word came out clipped. Military. She'd been learning to soften it, to add the upward inflection nurses used, the deference that made her invisible. It was a skill. Everything was a skill. "I'll have them ready by 11:30. Patricia was already moving to the next task, her attention already elsewhere. This was the pattern. Hannah completed her work. She was dependable. She asked no questions. She spoke only when necessary. After 8 months, no one really saw her anymore. They saw the job. They saw the tasks completed on time, the patients tended with quiet efficiency, the competence that bordered on unnerving if anyone had looked closely enough. No one looked closely. The ER doors hissed open at 11:22 a.m. The ambulance crew brought him in with the kind of controlled urgency that meant priority. Trauma alert. The man in the wheelchair was thin, muscular in the way of someone who'd rebuilt his body through sheer will, his left leg ending just above the knee. His right arm was bandaged from shoulder to wrist. His face was weathered, carved out of angles and survival, and his eyes moved constantly, counting exits, assessing threats, scanning for hostile positioning. Hannah recognized that eye movement. She'd seen it in every mirror for the past 12 years. "Bagram," the trauma resident asked, already unwrapping the dressing over the patient's ribs. 12 months ago, the veteran said. His voice was steady, measured. "Shrapnel still moving." Surgeon in Kandahar said they got most of it. Apparently not. Hannah was 3 beds down, ostensibly restocking the suture cart. She was listening. The veteran had been assigned to Trauma Bay 2. Dr. Pierce had been standing at the nurse's station. She'd watched him read the patient intake, watched his expression shift, not with concern, with calculation. Pierce moved to the phone. She heard him from her position near the supply cabinet, his voice smooth, practiced. Dr. Morrison. Got a complicated redebridement case. Bagram veteran, extensive shrapnel, possibly neovascular structures. I know you're booked, but this one might need your expertise. The pause. The head shake. Understood. Yes, I'll find someone else. He hung up and immediately dialed another extension. Dr. Patel? Hi, it's Pierce. Got an interesting one. Combat-related injury requires experience with military trauma that we don't typically see here. I'm wondering if you feel comfortable. The same pattern. The same gentle suggestion of liability, of insufficient expertise, of reasons not to take the case. By 11:51 a.m., 6 doctors had said no. By 12:08 p.m., the 7th had walked out mid-conversation. Hannah was at the medication dispenser when Dr. Pierce approached her. His expression was pleasant, the kind of pleasant that belonged to people who'd never been uncomfortable in their entire lives. His suit cost more than her annual rent. His watch was a Rolex. His shoes had probably been handmade. He represented everything the Navy had trained her to recognize and dismantle, dressed in a white coat and a practiced smile. Ms. Clarke, he said, and she heard the diminishment in the title choice. Not Hannah. Not the nurse. Ms. Clarke. A file to be managed. I notice you haven't been assigned floor coverage since 9:30. That seemed right to you. She turned, her hands empty, her expression neutral. 8 months of practice. I finished floor 3 assignments early. Right. Efficient. He said it like it was a character flaw. Well, we have a critical intake in Trauma Bay 2. Wheel in from Bagram. Complex surgical case. I've made some calls, but everyone's pretty booked today. She didn't respond. Waiting. That was part of the technique, let them fill the silence with what they wanted. I'm not sure the ER is really equipped for a redebridement of this complexity, Pierce continued. But if you had any interest in assisting whoever does end up taking the case, I'd note it in your file. Good initiative. He smiled then. It was the smile of someone practicing empathy, finding it an interesting discipline. Of course, it's probably above your current skill level anyway. These combat wounds are particular. Not really standard nursing protocol. The instinct was there, a specific and violent one, but Hannah had trained it out of herself 8 months ago when she checked in at personnel. Instead, she said, I'll be available if you need me. Pierce nodded, satisfied. He'd tested the waters. She'd accepted the ceiling he'd placed. The interaction lasted 14 seconds. As he walked away, Hannah's left hand moved to her pocket, where the folded flag was kept. It had traveled with her through 14 countries, 3 deployments, and 8 months in a hospital where nobody asked questions. It was roughly 4 inches by 6 inches, folded into a perfect triangle, weighted at one corner. The flag of someone else's funeral. The flag of someone she'd held while bleeding. She had been a captain. She had operated on soldiers in desert tents with nothing but field supplies and muscle memory. She had made decisions about who lived and who was already beyond reach. And now she was restocking suture carts and accepting the diagnosis that she was too inexperienced for a case that should have been routine. The irony was sharp enough to taste. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the veteran in Trauma Bay 2 had just made eye contact with her from across the bay. His expression had shifted from alertness to something else, recognition. His jaw had tightened slightly. His breathing had changed. He'd seen her restocking the sutures. He'd watched her hands. And his lips had moved, forming a single word that only she could read, breaker. The veteran's eyes locked onto hers the moment she stepped through the curtain, and something shifted in the fluorescent-lit air between them. His sister sat rigid in the plastic visitor's chair, arms crossed, her jaw tight with the same frustration that had consumed the last 3 hours. 7 doctors. 7 refusals. And now a nurse in blue scrubs with calloused fingers and a posture that didn't match her uniform. Hannah moved toward the wound site without acknowledging the recognition flickering across his face. The shrapnel laceration ran 6 inches along his left lateral thorax, the edges already showing early signs of infection despite the dressing change 4 hours ago. She began the assessment with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times in places where hesitation meant death. Vitals stable. Dressing intact. Pain level manageable. Documentation precise. The curtain snapped open. Dr. Pierce filled the doorway like a storm front, his white coat pristine, his expression sharp enough to draw blood. He was tall, the kind of tall that required other people to crane their necks, and he wore it like a weapon. Behind him, 2 residents lingered uncertainly, clearly hoping they wouldn't be needed for whatever was about to happen. Ms. Clarke. Not her first name. Never her first name. I need to speak with you. Now. Hannah didn't look up from the fall line she was checking. The saline dripped at the correct rate. Everything was protocol. Everything was perfect. I'm in the middle of patient care, doctor. Pierce stepped into the room, his presence making the space feel smaller. He pulled a tablet from his coat pocket and tapped the screen with unnecessary force. You have documented 3 separate charting errors in the past 8 months. 3. I have them flagged here. Incomplete vital sign timing on April 16th, missing provider signature on May 2nd. Medication reconciliation incomplete on June 8th. The veteran sister leaned forward, watching Hannah's reaction. The 2 residents in the doorway exchanged glances. Hannah's hand remained steady on the 4 pump. She turned to face Pierce, and her expression was the kind of blank that came from training, the kind that gave nothing away. Her jaw was set, but not clenched. Controlled. Deliberate. Those were corrected within the amendment window, Hannah said quietly. All within policy. They shouldn't have happened at all, Pierce said, and his voice dropped into a register that made the residents actually flinch. Charting errors indicate carelessness. Carelessness in a hospital setting indicates a fundamental lack of competence. And frankly, Ms. Clarke, I'm beginning to question whether you're adequately trained for the acuity of patients we treat here. The veteran sister made a sound, half gasp, half indignation, but Hannah raised one hand slightly, a gesture that said, not now. I understand, doctor, Hannah said. Her voice could have been carved from stone. Pierce wasn't finished. He stepped closer, and now his voice took on the edge of something personal, something cruel. You know what I think? I think you got comfortable here. Invisible. Doing your little tasks, no one noticing, no one paying attention. Maybe that works for most people. They accept the mediocrity. They accept being overlooked. He paused. He was studying her now, looking for the crack. But I don't accept mediocrity in my unit, Ms. Clarke. And I certainly don't accept it from nursing staff who think they can cut corners and hide behind protocol. Hannah didn't blink. She didn't look away. She didn't do any of the things that would have given him satisfaction. She simply stood there, present but untouched, like watching someone throw stones into a still lake and having them fall through nothing. The veteran was watching too. His eyes were narrowed, tracking something. Pierce's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The silence stretched for 3 seconds. 4. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like something mechanical and aware. I'm posting a formal written warning on the unit board, Pierce said finally. Consider this your notice that I will be monitoring your performance with particular attention. Any further errors, and we will be having a very different conversation about your future here. He turned on his heel and left, his white coat flaring slightly as he moved. The 2 residents scattered like startled birds. Hannah's hand was still on the fall line. Her breathing hadn't changed. She turned back to the veteran sister and nodded slightly, a gesture that said, it's fine. Everything is fine. This means nothing. but the veteran was still watching her with an expression that had shifted into something else entirely. Recognition. Not of her face, but of something deeper. The way she moved. The way she held herself. The way she absorbed a blow without flinching. The break room at 12:24 p.m. was crowded with the lunch shift nurses, 6 of them, maybe 7, scattered across the folding chairs and the corner table where someone had left a half-empty container of Thai takeout. The smell of hot sauce and fish oil hung heavy in the recycled air. Hannah pushed through the door with her sandwich, nothing fancy, turkey and mustard on wheat, the kind of lunch that didn't draw attention. She pulled a chair away from the main table and sat down. The room went dead silent. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was worse than that. It was the kind of quiet that happened when everyone simultaneously recognized a social failure and decided to correct it. One nurse stood up. Then another. Gathering lunch containers, checking their phones, suddenly remembering they had charting to finish, charts to review, calls to make. Within 45 seconds, only Hannah remained, her turkey sandwich sitting untouched on the plastic-wrapped paper plate in front of her. She unwrapped it anyway. Took a bite. Chewed. Swallowed. Took another bite. The sandwich tasted like nothing. By 3:22 p.m., the formal written warning was posted on the unit board by the nurses' station, a laminated sheet with her name in bold, the citation for documentation standards violations, the date, Pierce's signature. Official. Permanent. The kind of thing that stayed in a personnel file for years. Hannah read it once. Then she went back to work. The wound dressing on the veteran's laceration was due for a change at 5:51 p.m., and Hannah approached it with the same precision she'd applied to everything else that day. Fresh gauze. Sterile field. Antiseptic that smelled like chemistry and control. The veteran was sleeping, his sister having gone home around 4, promising to return in the morning with his favorite coffee. Hannah's hands moved across the wound site with something that looked like routine care and felt like something else entirely. She wasn't just cleaning and dressing. She was reading the tissue, assessing the inflammation trajectory, evaluating the infection risk. And when she reached for the suture to close a particularly deep tract, her hands moved into a technique that was neither standard textbook nor typical American trauma protocol. She used a modified running stitch, the kind that worked better in field conditions when supplies were limited and timing was critical. The kind that required understanding how tissue would heal under stress, how the body would respond to foreign materials in a high-heat environment, how sutures needed to be placed to account for swelling that came from desert dust and improvised medical care. The kind that had a name. The veteran's eyes snapped open. He watched her hands work for 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then his voice came out, rough from sleep, but absolutely certain. That's a Kandahar close. Hannah's hands didn't stop. The needle passed through tissue. The thread followed. Perfect tension. No tremor. Where'd a Norfolk nurse learn combat surgical? He whispered. She finished the final knot and clipped the thread. Then she looked at him, and her eyes held the weight of 1,000 things unsaid. For just a moment, one moment, the mask slipped. Not enough for anyone watching from outside to see it. But enough for someone who recognized the technique, enough for someone who understood what hands that moved like this actually were. Rest, she said quietly. Your body needs it. She stepped back from the bed, began wrapping the fresh dressing around the sealed wound, her movements returning to the careful choreography of a nurse. Normal. Professional. Invisible. But the veteran kept watching her. And his eyes had changed from recognition to something deeper. Understanding. The kind of understanding that came from having stood beside someone in the dark, from having trusted your life to hands that knew exactly what they were doing. That was the last time anyone called her just a nurse. Pierce was waiting when Hannah clocked in at 6:47 in the morning, which meant he'd arrived earlier, which meant he hadn't slept. The folder in his hands was thick. Institutional thickness. The kind that took hours to assemble. Captain's office. Now, he said, not looking at her, using her title like a knife. Hannah's jaw tightened for half a second. Just half. She followed him through corridors that still smelled like industrial antiseptic and yesterday's fear, past the nurse's station where 2 residents were reviewing charts, their eyes tracking Pierce's movement with the alertness of prey sensing a predator's shift in the wind. Nobody looked at Hannah. His office was small, aggressive in its neatness. 1 desk. 1 chair for him. She remained standing. Policy for 47B, Pierce began, not sitting either, which meant this wasn't a conversation. This was a performance. Unauthorized advanced procedures. Surgical interventions outside your scope of practice. Documentation of 3 previous infractions going back for months. He slid papers across the desk. Her name. Her signature forged well enough that even she had to look twice. The hospital board is being notified. HR. The state licensing board has already received preliminary notification of gross negligence. Hannah read the first page. Every word was technically accurate. No lies, just architecture. Like building a wall 1 perfect brick at a time and hoping nobody saw the cracks between them. You performed what appears to be an advanced suturing technique on Mr. Garrett yesterday. A technique, Pierce continued, his voice dropping into the register reserved for absolute certainty, that suggests training you do not possess and credentials you have not disclosed. That is a violation of hospital protocol, state medical law, and your employment agreement. He opened a second folder. A formal written warning. Already signed by 3 department heads. Already stamped. Already filed. This warning is being posted to the unit board at the end of this shift. All staff will be notified. You will receive your formal notice of suspension pending termination review by end of business today. Hannah looked at the papers without touching them. The fluorescent panels above hummed their mechanical song. Somewhere in the building, an elevator dinged. Ordinary sounds. Hospital sounds. The same rhythm that had been playing when she signed her employment contract, knowing it was temporary, knowing her real job was watching for black market military supply diversions and following the trail that led back to something bigger, someone more dangerous than a single arrogant surgeon. Is there anything you'd like to say? Pierce asked, and she understood the question wasn't actually a question. No, sir, Hannah said, her voice level and distant as a stone at the bottom of a very deep well. Then you're dismissed. She turned and walked out. 30 seconds later, she heard his door close and the sound of him making phone calls. Forwarding documents. Creating redundancy. Making her erasure official enough that no judge, no appeals board, no amount of outside intervention could make it less than it was. By 10:16, the warning was on the unit board in the break room. Hannah clipped in, poured coffee, and sat in her usual spot while the room drained like someone had pulled a plug. 2 nurses left within seconds. A resident who'd been eating yogurt abandoned it half-finished. By the time she was alone, the silence had that particular weight that comes from collective judgment. That wasn't what mattered anymore. At 11:32, she was changing Mr. Garrett's dressing. The shrapnel wound was healing in that particular way that told her his body had seen combat trauma before, understood how to heal from it, had internal maps for recovery that civilians simply didn't possess. The bandaging was clean. The site was dry. Everything was proceeding exactly as a routine dressing change should, which meant everything was about to explode. She saw the change in his face first. Not pain. Recognition. The kind of somatic understanding that comes when something inside your body tells your brain that something is profoundly, catastrophically wrong. She'd seen it in soldiers seconds before hemorrhagic collapse. She'd seen it in Kandahar operating theaters where a patient's internal clock ran faster than any monitor. Mr. Garrett. Pressure, he gasped. Chest. Right side. Like, his hand moved to his ribs and she was already moving, checking his oxygen, checking his color, seeing the pallor that meant his blood was redistributing away from his extremities, pooling somewhere it shouldn't be. The bandage was warm. Too warm. Not infection warm. Something worse. Shrapnel fragment. Migrating. The surgical reports had documented 3 pieces removed. But not all of them. Never all of them. Combat wounds held on to their secrets. His monitor spiked. Cardiac pressure. The kind that meant something was compressing his heart. "I need a crash cart," she said, and the 2 residents who'd been charting at the station didn't move immediately, which meant they were calculating whether to follow orders from the nurse who was about to be fired. Hannah looked at them with eyes that had spent for years looking at situations where hesitation meant body bags. "I said now." Something in her voice made them move. Not because she was authorized. Because every animal instinct in the human nervous system understands the difference between a request and a command issued by someone who knows exactly how to give one. The crash cart came. The attending called. Code Blue announced. Mr. Garrett's oxygen dropping, 68%, 71, 69. His pressure collapsing. His heart rate climbing to 162 as his body screamed that something was crushing the organ that kept him alive. "He's got a penetrating cardiac injury," Hannah said, not asked, stated. The kind of statement that transforms a nurse into something else. Shrapnel fragment in the pericardium. He needs emergency thoracotomy. Now. The attending, a man whose face she'd never really seen, who'd probably done 40 routine dressing changes without really being present for any of them, opened his mouth to order something, then stopped. Because Hannah was already moving toward the supplies. Because she was pulling a surgical kit with a kind of efficient precision that suggested she'd done this before. Because her hands were moving on their own, and the movements looked like prayer. "Get me a 14-gauge needle. Epinephrine ready. 1 milligram for push standing by," she said, and the residents were already moving, not because they understood that she was right, they couldn't possibly know that, but because her voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who was not making suggestions. The combat knife was in her bag. She'd carried it for 6 years. Against policy. Against hospital protocol. Against every single regulation that told her she shouldn't have military weapons in a civilian medical setting. She'd kept it because old habits persisted in old soldiers, and because sometimes you needed a tool that knew how to cut in a way that mattered. She didn't think about it. She didn't pause. Muscle memory took over. The kind of memory that came from field medicine in Kandahar where infrastructure was absent and you had to work with whatever you had and whatever you could improvise. She opened his chest between the ribs. Left anterolateral thoracotomy. The blade moved like it was made for this. Like some part of her had been waiting 6 months in this hospital for this exact moment. The scar tissue was fresh. The pericardial sac was visible. The shrapnel fragment glinted like something from a nightmare, a piece of war that had traveled through his body for 48 hours, waiting to stop his heart. Satin sky clamp. Now. Someone handed it to her without argument. She clamped the bleeding vessel. The O2 monitor climbed, 75%, 78, 82. His pressure stabilizing. His heart rate beginning the long walk back down from catastrophe. She removed the fragment with forceps. Held it up to the light. A piece of metal maybe the size of her thumbnail. A piece small enough to fit between 2 fingers. A piece that had almost killed him. For minutes. That was the entire operation. For minutes from collapse to stability. For minutes from the kind of death that has a clock ticking in the background to the kind of breathing that sounds like gratitude. His oxygen, 88%. 90. Stable. The room was completely silent. Not the usual hospital silence. The silence that comes when people have just watched something that contradicts every framework they thought they understood about the world and their place in it. The 2 residents were staring at her hands. The attending was staring at her face. Mr. Garrett was alive, breathing, his monitor beeping its steady reassurance that his heart had remembered how to work again. "Close him up," Hannah said, stepping back, her voice dropping back into the register of someone who was merely a nurse. Subcutaneous closure at the pericardium. Running whip stitch. Make sure the pleural cavity is clear of blood. He'll need chest films in recovery. She stepped away from the table. peeled off her gloves. The blood came off her hands under running water, rust-colored against white porcelain, running down the sink in patterns that looked like maps of places she'd left behind. Nobody spoke. Nobody asked questions. The attending started the closing while Hannah walked back out into the corridor where the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical indifference and the hospital continued its business, completely unaware that something fundamental had just shifted in the power structure of this place. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, Pierce had already suspended her credentials. 6 violations cited. Unauthorized practice. Gross negligence. Endangering a patient. Exceeding scope of practice. Violation of hospital policy for 47B and 14 other regulations that he'd cross-referenced with enough precision to make her termination legally airtight. He'd sent copies to administration, to the state board, to HR. By 1:46, Hannah was standing in the hospital laundry in the basement, where the steam rose from industrial machines and nobody ever came voluntarily. She had her blue scrubs in her hands. The ones from yesterday. The ones from 6 months of shift work and night call and small invisible acts that had kept this place running while nobody knew her name. She folded them with parade ground precision. The kind of fold that comes from muscle memory of a different life. Where your clothes were issued and your movements were synchronized and your purpose was understood without needing to ask. The blue cotton was soft from 100 washings. It smelled like detergent and industrial bleach and the particular scent of places where broken people came to be repaired. She placed them in the donation bin, which was perhaps the kindest interpretation of what she was doing. Returning them. Submitting to the erasure. In 14 hours, federal agents would be moving through this building like a coordinated storm system. They would have arrest warrants. They would have evidence of 18 months of fraudulent billing. They would walk Pierce out in handcuffs while the nurses' station watched and understood, finally, that they had misjudged the quiet person in the room so completely that they might never recover from it. But that wasn't what happened yet. Right now, Hannah Clarke folded her scrubs in the basement laundry, and the fluorescent lights hummed above her, and she was completely, absolutely alone. The basement laundry smelled like bleach and industrial heat. Hannah folded the blue scrubs into precise thirds, the way she'd been taught to fold field uniforms 18 years ago. The crease ran perfect and straight down the center. Hospital cotton. Not combat grade, but the mechanics were identical. Crease. Fold. Stack. Crease. Fold. Stack. Her hands didn't shake. The fluorescent tubes above flickered once, twice, casting her shadow across the folding table like something being erased. She worked alone at 3 in the morning. The night shift supervisor had already made it clear, turn in your badge, clear your locker, don't come back. 6 fabricated protocol violations. Suspension pending termination. All of it typed in bureaucratic precision by a man who had never met her until 8 months ago. Pierce had built his case with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting for the excuse. She placed the last folded set on the aluminum cart. Navy blue rectangles, each one identical. Each one a lie. The lie that she was just a nurse. The lie that she could blend into beige walls and disappear into shift rotations and stay invisible. The lie had lasted 8 months. That was longer than she'd expected. Hannah pulled off her compression badge, the one with a photo of someone named Margaret Chen, registered nurse, hired through a staffing agency that didn't exist outside of Pentagon paperwork. She set it face down on the stack of scrubs. The plastic caught the fluorescent light and threw it back at her like an accusation. She had come to St. Michael's because Naval Intelligence needed to know why military medical supply shipments destined for Walter Reed were being diverted. Where they were going. Who was profiting? The paper trail had led through procurement departments and inventory spreadsheets until it landed on Dr. Martin Pierce's signature. 17 months of inflated billing. Phantom orders for equipment that never arrived at the hospital. Someone was moving 6-figure quantities of government-issued surgical supplies through his department, and the money was being routed through shell companies registered to his wife's maiden name. She had been 6 days away from solid proof when Mr. Garrett arrived in a wheelchair with shrapnel embedded in places that required expertise most civilian surgeons didn't possess. And she had recognized him. The veteran had served in her unit. Not under her command, but alongside her. Kandahar, 2014. His name was on casualty lists she'd never wanted to read, marked as killed in action until he wasn't. Until he wheeled into her hospital bearing wounds that looked like the kind of injuries you got when you survived something that was supposed to kill you. When his hand had grabbed her wrist during the wound closure, when he'd whispered her call sign, the one that hadn't been spoken aloud in civilian spaces in 7 years, she had known her cover was compromised. And then Pierce had fired her for saving his life. Hannah picked up her locker key from the laundry shelf. The key was made of brass the color of old blood. She had memorized the weight of it over 8 months, the specific pressure it created in her scrub pocket, right against her ribs, close enough to her heartbeat that she could almost believe it was part of her body. The walk to the employee locker room took 4 minutes. She knew this because she had timed every route in this hospital on the second day. Emergency exits. Stairwell distances. The precise moment when the security camera cycled to the eastern corridor. She had built mental maps the way soldiers do, always knowing which direction was out. The locker was small. A paperback novel she'd never opened. 3 pairs of backup scrubs, already stripped of any identification. A photograph she shouldn't have kept, her and Mr. Garrett, taken in 2014 outside a medical tent in Kandahar, both of them in desert camouflage, both of them still believing they would make it home. She stared at it for exactly 3 seconds, then folded it into 4s and slipped it into her jacket pocket. At the bottom of the locker, wrapped in a sealed plastic bag, was the flag. Her teammate's flag. The one that had been folded into a triangle and presented to a family that would never understand who their son had really been. Before the ceremony, before the politicians and the guns and the witnesses, Mr. Garrett had taken the flag off the casket for exactly 90 seconds and handed it to Hannah. "Bring it home," he'd said. "Not to his family. To you. Bring it home where it matters." She had carried it in a duffel bag for 4 years. Then in a desk drawer. Then in a cardboard box in a storage unit she paid for in cash. And finally, when Naval Intelligence briefed her on this assignment, she had brought it to Norfolk and hidden it in her locker at St. Michael's Hospital, waiting for a moment when she might need to remember who she actually was. The moment had come and gone in the time it took a monitor to display 3 words, sinus rhythm. Stable. Hannah picked up the folded flag and held it in both hands. The plastic crinkled. The fabric inside had faded from years of storage, the red no longer sharp, the white gone the color of old newspaper. This flag had been present at a funeral. It had been a widow's only memento. It had been her teammate's final resting place before being entrusted to a woman no one at this hospital knew. She could throw it away. Walk out of St. Michael's and never look back and let this flag go to a landfill where it would decompose alongside coffee cups and medical waste and the rest of the discarded things that nobody wanted anymore. She could become Margaret Chen permanently. Get a real job at a real hospital in a real city where nobody knew her call sign or the kind of damage her hands were capable of. Start over. Disappear into the American civilian infrastructure the way she was trained to disappear. The plastic bag felt impossibly light. Hannah unfolded it with the same precision she'd used on the scrubs. The flag was smaller than she remembered. Military flags always were, compact, portable, meant to fit in a casket or a locker or the pocket of someone who was still fighting a war nobody else understood. She held it by the corner, the same way you hold something sacred that might shatter. The basement was empty. 3 in the morning meant the night shift was in the ER, in the ICU, in the places where people were actively breaking. Nobody came to the laundry. Nobody came to witness anything at this hour. But someone had come. And someone had been watching. Footsteps. Light ones, barefoot or in soft shoes. Hannah didn't turn around. She folded the flag back into its triangle and slipped it inside her jacket, right against her chest, where it belonged. The figure in the doorway was Mr. Garrett, still in his hospital gown, still wearing the compression bandages she had placed across his chest 4 hours ago when he was coding and the monitors were screaming his name. "You were supposed to deny it," he said quietly. His voice had changed since Kandahar. Deeper. Rougher. The kind of voice that came from breathing with one lung partially compromised by shrapnel, from years of physical therapy that would never quite restore what had been lost. "Deny what?" Hannah asked. She didn't look at him. She kept her hands on the locker door, her jaw level, her breath steady. "That you knew me. That you recognized what you were seeing when they wheeled me in. You were supposed to be a nurse. Just a nurse. Nurses don't know Kandahar closes. They don't know how to perform thoracotomies with a knife. They don't know how to give orders that combat officers obey." "I am just a nurse," Hannah said. "No." Garrett took a step into the laundry room. His left leg was weaker, nerve damage from the original blast, probably. The wheelchair hadn't been an aesthetic choice. "You're Captain Hannah Clarke. Silver Star recipient. You served under the call sign Angel 6. You saved my life at Jalabad. And you just saved my life again. And Dr. Pierce knew exactly who you were the moment you volunteered, which is why he had to get you out before you figured out why those supply orders didn't match the shipping manifests." Hannah closed her eyes. 8 months of invisible work had taken her from intel analyst to data consultant to finally, carefully, into nursing school with paperwork that would withstand standard background checks. 8 months of becoming Margaret Chen piece by piece until Margaret Chen was the only story she told herself before sleep. "I can't confirm any of that," Hannah said. "You don't have to." Garrett stepped closer. In the fluorescent light, she could see the surveillance bandage placement, the way she'd marked the secondary shrapnel entry point with a permanent marker so the surgeons who came after would know exactly where to probe. "Because I kept something. When they admitted me, my sister brought my belongings from the care facility where I've been for the last 3 years. And in that bag, there's a personnel file that was never supposed to leave a classified setting. There's a copy of a commendation that should have been redacted. There's a photograph of you in dress uniform with 3 medals pinned to your chest." He pulled a manila envelope from the deep pocket of his hospital gown. It was creased and water-stained and somehow still sealed. "And there's your copy of the flag," he said. "The one you gave me at the funeral. Before the ceremony. When it was just us and the casket and nobody who gave a shit about the paperwork." Hannah's hands trembled. Not from fear. Not from the realization that her identity was no longer a secret. The trembling came from something older, from the muscle memory of carrying a folded flag across a desert at sunrise, from the weight of knowing that some wars don't end even after you've come home. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "What are you?" Garrett held out the envelope. "Because right now, you can take this and walk. Or you can take this and wait. Either way, there's a Navy SEALs rescue team about 47 minutes away from picking you up at the east entrance. My sister didn't call for an ambulance 3 hours ago. She called a secure number that's been in my pocket since the day I was admitted. So the choice is yours, Captain. But you should know, they're already on their way." Hannah turned to look at him. In the fluorescent light, Mr. Garrett looked like a man who had died once and come back to settle unfinished business. His eyes had that quality that came from staring down impossibility and refusing to blink. "Go," he said quietly. "They're coming to pick you up. Not as Margaret Chen. As yourself. They're coming because of what you did in that trauma bay. They're coming because you performed a procedure that shouldn't have been possible. They're coming because someone who has clearance above my pay grade decided that the supply diversion investigation isn't your problem anymore, it's theirs." The envelope felt warm in Hannah's hands. Outside, through the small basement window, she heard it. A distant sound like the sky breaking open. The distinctive thud-thud-thud of helicopter rotors approaching from the east, moving fast and low enough to set off car alarms in the parking lot. The rotor wash hit the windows like a physical force. The thud-thud-thud grew louder, so close the fluorescent lights above Garrett's bed began to flicker in rhythm with the blades cutting air. Car alarms wailed in the parking lot. Nurses wheeled toward the windows, squinting against the dawn light bouncing off metal fuselage. One of them whispered, "Is that a military helicopter?" Hannah stood motionless at Garrett's bedside, her hand still wrapped in the blood-stained latex gloves from surgery. She had folded her scrubs. She had returned her badge. She had walked out. And now the sky itself was breaking open above Norfolk, Virginia, for a man in a wheelchair with migrating shrapnel and a memory like a military database. The elevator doors chimed. Boots on tile. Real boots, not hospital-issue clogs. 3 soldiers in dress greens moved through the corridor with the precision of people who knew exactly where they were going. Behind them, a 2-star general with silver on his shoulders and medals that caught the fluorescent light like signals. His presence made the air pressure change. Dr. Pierce emerged from the stairwell at the exact wrong moment. The general stepped into Garrett's room without knocking. Without asking permission. The 2 junior officers flanked the door with their hands clasped in front of them, the kind of stillness that comes from standing at gates that matter. "Mr. Garrett," the general said. His voice carried the texture of command layered over decades. "I'm Major General Richardson, Joint Special Operations Command. We need to speak with your medic." Hannah didn't move. Pierce had stopped in the doorway, his face already darkening with the beginning of rage. A Marine colonel in dress blues entered behind the general, carrying a manila folder. His rank insignia gleamed, the eagle and anchor catching light. He looked at Hannah with eyes that had already seen through her uniform, past her scrubs, down to the call sign the veteran had whispered. "Captain Hannah Clarke," the colonel said aloud. His voice made it official. Made it real. Special Forces. Silver Star for Valor at Bagram. Combat Action Ribbon. Purple Heart. Distinguished Service in Operation Enduring Freedom under classified operational parameters. Pierce's hand clenched. "What in the hell is happening in my hospital?" "Your hospital?" The general didn't look at him. His attention remained fixed on Hannah's hands, still wrapped in bloody latex, still marked by the work of saving a man the doctor had tried to bury. The salute came next, crisp and deliberate, a fist pressed to the general's chest. The gesture of respect between soldiers. Recognition. Acknowledgement of sacrifice that lived in places this hospital would never understand. A woman in civilian clothes stepped forward. Dark suit. Badge clipped to her belt. Her eyes had the flint quality of federal authority, the kind that didn't negotiate. "Captain Clarke's assignment here was authorized under Operation Medical Integrity," she said. She wasn't asking Pierce's permission. She was informing him of facts already decided. A classified investigation into supply chain diversion and fraudulent medical billing at this facility. She was embedded as nursing staff. Pierce's voice cracked. "I demand to know what this is about. I demand." "You're not in a position to demand anything," the woman in the suit said. She held up her phone, and suddenly 3 other federal agents appeared in the doorway, 2 men and a woman, their windbreakers stamped with 3 letters that made Pierce's face go the color of old newspaper. "FBI. Dr. James Pierce," one of the agents said. "We've been monitoring your computer activity for 12 weeks. We have evidence you attempted to delete and forge Captain Clarke's employment records approximately 47 minutes ago, approximately 5:13 a.m. this morning. Your digital footprints led us to 18 months of fraudulent billing records, phantom medical supply orders totaling $863,000, and kickback arrangements with 3 external vendors. You were using Medicaid coverage delays and insurance pre-authorization holds as a method to justify patient refusals while you manipulated equipment procurement records." Pierce opened his mouth. Closed it. His hands began to tremble, real trembling, the kind that came from watching leverage turn to ash. Those are, he gestured wildly at Hannah. "She sabotaged my records. She forged those documents. I can prove." "You can prove nothing," the agent interrupted. "Because we have the server logs. We have the timestamps. We have footage from the hallway camera when you entered the medical records office at 5:06 a.m., exactly 12 minutes after Captain Clarke's termination was finalized. You're the only person on that tape, Dr. Pierce. And you were alone when you attempted to access her file. The silence in the room was so thick you could operate in it. Pierce looked at his colleagues in the doorway. Most of them looked away. 2 nurses from the night shift had stopped at the threshold, watching. Their faces were blank, the kind of blank that meant they had always suspected something. Always known. You're under arrest for federal fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, another agent said. The handcuffs appeared like they had been waiting in his pocket for exactly this moment. You have the right to remain silent. They cuffed him in the hallway. The metal clicked with surgical precision. His protests echoed down the corridor, hollow, increasingly desperate, the sound of a man watching his world compress into a single fact: he was guilty and they had proof. They walked him past the nurse's station where his written warning about Hannah still hung on the bulletin board. Every nurse on duty watched him pass. Nobody looked away this time. The unit secretary didn't even pretend to work. The respiratory therapist lowered her phone and stared. A medical student froze mid-documentation. Hannah stood in Garrett's doorway with the general beside her. She had removed her gloves. Her hands were steady. 6 months later, she sat in a small office on the 6th floor of the Naval Intelligence Field Operations Center in Alexandria, Virginia. Her next assignment briefing was scheduled for 2 p.m. hours. The folded flag from her fallen teammate sat on her desk next to a framed photograph, her unit photo from 2019, faces weathered by sun that came from a different hemisphere. Beside it lay a handwritten note on hospital stationery, the handwriting slightly uneven, the letters carefully formed by someone unused to holding a pen. Still here because of you, Captain. Still here because someone finally looked. Still here because you didn't walk away. Garrett, Dark Horse. She picked up the flag. The cloth was soft from being folded 10,000 times. From being carried through places that broke men. From being pressed into her hands by a soldier who trusted her to remember him if he didn't make it back. She had made it back. He had made it back. And the quiet nurse who nobody had bothered to see clearly had saved both their lives by becoming the person she had always been, a warrior, a medic, a soldier who understood that the most dangerous people in any room were the ones nobody thought to look at. Her phone buzzed. A text from General Richardson: "Excellent work. Your next deployment begins Monday. Welcome home, Captain." She looked at the photograph. At Garrett's note. At the flag that meant everything and nothing depending on whether you understood what it represented. Heroes didn't wear capes. They folded flags. They returned scrubs to hospital laundry with parade ground precision. They stood silent while men screamed because the screaming was never the point. The screaming was just noise. The work was everything. Hannah Clarke looked out the window at Alexandria's morning light and prepared for her next mission. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the knowledge that she had already survived the worst things humans could design, and she had chosen to return to places where she could save them anyway. The quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like Hannah's. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if you discovered that someone at your workplace was systematically defrauding patients? Would you have blown your cover to stop it, or would you have waited for the investigation to conclude? Let me know in the comments.